Shalom Uvracha. Two amazing, two huge promises HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises Avraham Avinu. One of them is the promise of the land. HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised Avraham Avinu the land of Israel. The other promise is the promise of progeny, of offspring. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Avraham Avinu that his offspring, Zeracha, will be Ke'afara Aretz, like the earth, like the dust of the earth. Both of these promises begin to be realized in the lifetime of Avraham Avinu. On the one hand, Avraham lives in Eretz Israel. On the other hand, he has Yitzchak as a son. But in Parashas Chayei Sarah, we also find how these promises continue on beyond the lifetime of Avraham Avinu. On the one hand, Avraham Avinu doesn't just live in Eretz Israel, but he also has an acquisition on Eretz Israel, which will outlive him. It will be for generations to come. And that's in Ma'aras HaMachpelah, where he buries Sarah. On the other hand, Avraham Avinu also sees how Yitzchak finds a Kala, he gets married, and he too will have children. So on the one hand, we have the promises, and on the other hand, we have their realization, not just in Avraham Avinu's time, but also beyond. But the interesting thing to note is that in both of these areas, both the land of Israel and the offspring, the progeny, these promises are not fulfilled without a great deal of investment on Avraham Avinu's part. They don't come for nothing. Avraham Avinu has to work very hard in order to acquire Ma'aras HaMachpelah from Ephron Achiti, from the Bnei Ches. He has to work hard, and the Torah spends a good few psukim just to describe how this came about, how this transpired. And of course, in finding a Kala for Yitzchak, Avraham Avinu has to work even harder. He sends Eliezer. Eliezer has to travel a great distance. He has to do all kinds of hishtadlus, all kinds of investment of energies, and he does a certain trick to find who will be the appropriate wife for Yitzchak. It's not easy. It's not easy going. It requires a lot of investment. And the question is why? If HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised the land and promised the progeny, the offspring, then why does Avraham Avinu have to be so busy trying to realize this promise? Shouldn't it be realized by itself? I think we find the answer to this question in the Gemara Maseches Nida. The Gemara in Nida Daf Ayin speaks about the basic necessities that all of us need, or all of us want. One of them is wealth, one of them is wisdom, and the third is children. And the Gemara says, in all three of these, we have to make our own efforts. We have to invest our energies. On the one hand, if a person wants to be rich, then he needs to do business. On the other, if he wants to be wise, then he has to study. On the one hand, the pragmatia, to do business. On the other hand, Yasek be yeshiva, he needs to study, and of course having children. But the Gemara says, on all three levels, that many do this and it doesn't work. People do business and they don't get rich, or they study and they don't become wise. Says the Gemara, we have to add another ingredient. There's a second element. And the second element is bringing in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have to bring him into the picture. And we do so by davening. We have to also daven Lemisha Oisha Shaloi, to the one whose the wealth is his, and Lemisha Chochma Shaloi, that the wisdom is his, and the same thing for children. And what we learn from the Gemara is that even in attaining the basic tools for life, right? These are tools. Wealth on the one hand, wisdom on the other hand. These are tools with which we can, these are kalim, right? What we call vessels. Into these vessels, we can bring in the content of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the content of Torah, the content of connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But these themselves are kalim, these are vessels. But even in attaining the vessels, even in attaining the wealth and the wisdom and the future generations, even in this, we need to bring in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In order that the kalim, in order that the vessels should be appropriate, should be fitting for that content, then we need to bring HaKadosh Baruch Hu even into their attainment, even into their bringing them about, into reaching them. And this is the story of Avraham Avinu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises him the land on the one hand and the nation on the other. The land and the nation, these are kelim. These are vessels, as it were. These are the tools. We have to realize the content of Klal Yisrael, the tzedakah umishpat of Avraham Avinu, the Kol HaTorah Kula that we receive at Sinai, the relationship with the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All of these things are realized through these tools. This is the content that we have to bring in to these vessels of the land on the one hand and of the nation on the other. But the Torah teaches us that if the vessels themselves, if the land on the one hand, the nation on the other, are to be ready, are to be the type of vessels that are appropriate, that are possible to hold this content, then even in attaining them, we have to bring in a HaKadosh Baruch Hu through our own efforts. And that's what Avraham Avinu does. In all of his ways, whether it's the land, whether it's, of course, to find a Kala for Yitzchak, in all of these, he brings a HaKadosh Baruch Hu into the process itself, in order that the Kalim, in order that the land, and in order that the future generations should be the type of land and the type of nation that's ready, that's appropriate for the teichen, for the content of Klal Yisrael. Some of these Divrei Torah, I learned from Rabbi Sacks in his writings on Parashas Chayei Sarah. And the other part of this, I learned from his ways of life, from his life itself. Rabbi Sacks, who we lost this week, was the epitome of this combination of amazing vessels on the one hand, his wisdom, his knowledge, his erudition, and also his talent, his eloquence of speech, his ability to forge connections, and so on. But even in the Kalim themselves, even in these vessels, this toolkit that he possessed, he was so careful always to bring in this other dimension, the dimension of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to elevate, to bring Kedusha, not just after everything was in place, that all you need to do is to pour in the oires, to pour in the light into these vessels, but no, even as he forged them, even as he was busy trying to set up the next structure. I remember meeting him once in Eretz Yisrael, and he was explaining how his next mission is from being I say it in his words, a Rav of the Goyim, of forging the connections, of teaching the nations about Judaism, of teaching the nations about relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. He wants to become the Rav of the Yidden, to make sure that his legacy will be a true legacy in Klal Yisrael, internally, and we spoke about Haredi society and so on. But even as he was thinking about the structural issues, he was so careful to bring in a HaKadosh Baruch Hu into the picture. What does a HaKadosh Baruch Hu want from this? How will we be able to make this a Torah project in the full depth of the word, in the full profundity of what it means to live the relationship with a HaKadosh Baruch Hu in all our ways? These Divrei Torah should be an Ilui Neshama for the great persona of Rabbi Sacks, who we lost this week tragically, and we should all have a beautiful Shabbos.